possibility that Huerman's family could somehow be implicated, as this one attorney is suggesting this week?
Well, I think with the evidence that is known to date, no.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. And welcome to episode 9 in this series. By the way, there is a playlist. If you're coming into this whole series late, you are welcome to go through the entire playlist. It's already 12 episodes with 2 more to go. I'll put a link to that in the description. And so you've just heard Jennifer Coffindaffer address this question. Is there a possibility that Huerman's family members could be somehow implicated? Briefly, she answers no. But what else does she say?
I think we also have to keep in mind the age of his daughter at that time. In fact, wouldn't have even been born, I believe, and just been very young during some of the murders that have occurred. So I think at this point, it's unfair to point the finger at Asa Ellerup and Rex Huerman's daughter. And law enforcement has certainly, at this point anyway, cleared them.
Exactly. The imputed Long Island serial killer gives us potential insight into several other high-profile cases. And guess what? Those several other high-profile cases give us a certain perspective into this case. And through these cases, what happens?
They met someone they did not expect.
It turns out, and I've been saying this all along, Rex Huerman isn't as rare or unusual a psychology as you might imagine. Equally, some of the cases we've dealt with and know through and through help us to understand this case, this animal, in reverse. We see him not by looking at him, but by looking elsewhere. And my, surprise, surprise, we see how he's the same. And yes, also, he's a different beast. Before we get to that, I want to deal with Jennifer Coffindaffer's assessment, the one that she shared recently on News Nation. I'll also put a link to that in the description. I also recommend that you follow Coffindaffer's summaries of the Karen Reed trial. They're brief, they're on point, they are appropriately scornful of the far-fetched defense conspiracies. If you didn't like that, please unsubscribe immediately. And also, she posts clear, concise, daily summaries on X. So if you're not following that, you really should. Now, a day or so ago, Coffindaffer was asked about the importance of photographs that have recently surfaced of Huerman at a shooting range in Manorville. Now, before we get to the InteREXtualities, or more appropriately, the InteREXtualities, just days, he was there at the shooting range just days before, I think it was one day before, one of his first victims disappeared. And so the question is, how important are these photos? Coffindaffer was asked this question. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you're enjoying this analysis, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started.
How important are they of Huerman placing him at this gun club? What does this hope to establish?
They're very important, Natasha, and this is why when you have a case that is this old, you have to build a historic evidence. You have to build up that evidence to lead you to the suspect.
And this is why the DNA alone isn't going to cut it. I mean, Asa Ellerup's hair and DNA is also on some of the victims, but she was in another state. So to make the case against Huerman, the prosecutor needs to place him in the area. He needs to be placed in the area close to the scene, and these images do precisely that. He's in the area, not only in the area, but at the time as well. Coffindaffer goes on to note,
putting him in a situation where he was indeed familiar with this very remote area is crucial in terms of placing him near the scene of where those bodies were dumped.
Okay, and so with that out the way, we are now going to dive into the InteREXtualities, and prepare to have your socks blown off. We're going to deal with 4 cases. Suzanne Morphew the Idaho 4 and John Benet Ramsey, and obviously also the Long Island serial killer. So we're going to really mix those 4 cases up, and you're going to be quite surprised at how connected the fabric actually is. Now, let's start with Suzanne Morphew. In the Morphew case, one of the theories is this idea of hunting animals potentially translating to hunting a person. Now, we know in the Rex Heuermann case, he actually uses the word hunt. He seems to be using that word as a symbolic code for what he does when he commits one of these crimes. Now, both suspects in the Long Island and Salida cases are hunters. They're not just occasional hunters, it's a big part of their identities. Both seem to be expressing their manliness, deriving their masculinity through not only hunting. It's not just that they hunt animals, there's a lot more to it. There's the skinning, there's the disemboweling of animals, and it's lots of animals as well. Also, both hunters have large arsenals of weapons. Barry Morphew doesn't just have a couple of firearms, he's also got things like crossbows. Barry Morphew's alibi is actually that he was sort of in a hunting mode. He was either shooting chipmunks or following a big deer. And one of the first things he says when he encounters police is, was it a mountain lion? In other words, he's almost still talking in a sort of a hunting code. He wants to know, did a mountain lion hunt and kill his wife? Now, when dealing with the bloodiness of hunters doing their thing, we see with Heuermann a high likelihood of dismemberment. We also know that Suzanne Morphew was found as a partial skeleton, similar to some of Heuermann's victims, and guess what? Missing her feet and hands. And so you have a similar thing. Some parts of the skeleton are simply not there. They're scattered somewhere else. Suzanne Morphew and so far all of Heuermann's victims were found out in the open, in the outdoors, in the wilderness, after a considerable period of time had passed. And so the skill in camouflaging the remains, getting rid of the remains, getting rid of all the body artifacts, the blood, the tissues, that also takes some considerable skill, some considerable experience. We heard Jennifer Coffendaffer saying a moment ago that you have to build historic evidence. You have to build up that evidence to lead you to the suspect. And she's talking about when quite a lot of time has gone by, right? And so in a strictly legal sense, law enforcement in the Morphew case are faced with the challenge of linking their suspect to the remains and the burial ground in Moffat. If the question is, how can you link Morphew to Moffat? One possible answer is that, well, there's a golf course. I've actually been to it. It's just around the corner from the open grave. It's about 2 to 3 miles plus or minus up the road towards Crestone. We know that Barry Morphew was a big golfer. In fact, that's how he met Suzanne, and I think that was the first time he kissed her. Did he ever play golf there? When last did he play golf at the Challenger Golf Club? Just think about the potential InteREXtuality we have here. Someone playing golf, maybe, and someone at some other club playing his games, right? Very close to where human remains were found. Now, besides all this, where is the ground zero of the crime scene when we're dealing with a hunter? Where is the hunter most comfortable? Well, it appears in his own home, within his own territory, so to speak. Also, if Heuermann was interested in books like MindHunter by John Douglas, which are about crimes and criminals, Barry Morphew was also interested in listening to true crime shows, and we know that because it was something that I think was recorded on her spy pen. And one of those crime shows included one that involved adultery, a murderous spouse, and staging the crime to look like an accident. According to the affidavit, Barry further listened to the forensic files case of Walter Scott, a man that went missing but was later determined to be a homicide victim of James Williams. While Scott was married to Joanne, he had an affair with a woman named Suzanne. Meanwhile, Joanne was cheating with a man named James Williams. Williams killed his first wife through a staged car accident and married Joanne after killing Scott. Walter was reported to be acting not himself in the days prior to his disappearance. Now, a reverse insight that we may get from the Heuermann case into the Morphew case is a level of sadism that we may have vastly underestimated. And when some of the evidence came through, it's this idea that was she shot with a dart gun, and was she actually alive for a considerable period, allowing this serum to basically enter her bone marrow. And that casts the whole homicide into a totally different and, if I may say so, ghastly light. And that then takes us into the next one, the Idaho 4. Now, remember, a lot of these cases are sub judice, so we do presume innocence until proven guilty. We're just going to look at some of the broad similarities. Let's call them psychological symmetries. And although Brian Kohberger isn't a hunter like Heuermann or Barry Morphew, he comes pretty close in some respects. He had an interest in the military. He was aspiring at one stage to be an Army Ranger and later developing an interest in law enforcement. Like Heuermann, Kohberger was mercilessly bullied at school, including, if you can believe it, by girls. The chubby misfit was bullied by the popular girls, and according to one source, the girls he's accused of killing were much like the ones that made fun of him through his childhood. And guess who said that? That was an observation made by one of the girls that was at school with him. She kind of recognized the type of girl that bullied him in terms of the victims. Now, Kohberger also pursued girls in a similar fashion to Heuermann I'm talking about at school, by leaving love letters in their lockers. Kohberger, then a chubby, awkward misfit, would become relentless in his pursuit, repeatedly leaving love letters in her locker and telling her he liked her, according to the mom. He would always say, "Oh, Kim, I think you're very pretty," just weird comments. And she'd say, "Oh my God, leave me alone." So there's a strong sense that Kohberger, described as quiet, awkward, and shy, similar terms to Heuermann, ultimately didn't have any friends, never seemed to have a girlfriend, and was basically an incel, involuntarily celibate. According to an article from Fox 10, someone said that they don't remember him ever having a girlfriend, and he didn't seem to have many friends. And so there's isolation here. So a lot of psychological similarities between Kohberger and Heuermann. At some point, Kohberger went from being a shy kid to being a mean person with a chip on his shoulder, and we had the same thing happen with Heuermann, where he was described as developing a mean streak even while he was in high school, right? Now, like Heuermann, Kohberger clearly had a bone to pick eventually with the opposite sex. Bad Teachergate exposed some of Kohberger's apparent misogyny and a seeming sexist attitude to women. In fact, did you know that he was fired from his academic position? Well, that is Bad Teachergate, because of his dodgy attitude to women. Now, like Heuermann and Barry Morphew, Brian Kohberger was actually studying crime far more than the other two. He was studying crime in the run-up to the murders, and he was probably applying that knowledge to or possibly, allegedly, applying that knowledge to what ultimately happened. That's certainly the case that the prosecution are probably going to be fielding. Now, if Heuermann had a porn addiction and fixation, Kohberger was a heroin addict. Now, we don't know the status of his addiction closer to the time, but one does wonder, because addictions can interfere with things like impulsivity and impulse control. It can also interfere with our perception of reality. Porn also seems to be a factor that comes up in the Morphew affidavit, and also seems to relate to inappropriately young women, although Morphew has denied this. And that is something that I think comes up in all three of these cases. Kohberger's victims are much younger than what he is. Heuermann's victims are much younger than what he is, right? And anyway, through inference, it's possible Kohberger also developed an interest in pornography. I guess we will see when it goes to trial, perhaps even sexual fantasies as well. That's not that unlikely with young men anyway, but the important part to stress is there's also a quasi-hunting element in this idea of Kohberger driving around and possibly looking in through the large windows of the funhouse and being able to see into the lives of others and sensing the youth he missed. This awakens not only jealousy, but resentment, and perhaps also strong feelings of revenge. In Huerman's case, the window he has into the world are the streets of Manhattan, crowded with young, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed up-and-comers, tourists, other talented, beautiful folks who have arrived in America's promised land. If you've never been to Manhattan, you probably wouldn't have seen these folks, ambitious, young go-getters. You see them running through Central Park. You see them strutting down the sidewalk. Some of them are models. Some of them are bankers. It's kind of type A personalities. In Barry Morphew's case, possibly his window into another world was the gym, where he encounters younger, fitter, healthier women like Morgan Gentile, certainly younger than his own wife. Now, the use of the K-bar knife by the killer is also an interesting weapon. It's not a conventional weapon. It's a kind of thing that a hunter might use. And we do know that there is a hunting aspect to some extent in Koberger's backstory, where he worked in a sort of, not sure what you call it, but like a fishing scenario where people would fish and then he would skin the fish for them. And so you do have that kind of aspect in his backstory. He would be gutting the fish and cleaning the fish and all that kind of thing. And so this scenario of the killer in the Idaho 4 case using a knife, that's not incidental. He wants to inflict maximum pain. He wants to feel and see, and he wants that pain he wants to see maximum destruction. It's payback for the humiliation in a school and university setting. It's payback for being bullied, for having his whole life, certainly the love and sexual aspect, which is huge in high school and college, negated. That's certainly one scenario. And so, like Huerman, Koberger has a surfeit of compensatory aggression building up, doesn't he? Doesn't he have that from his own troubled past? And how does he deal with it? Does he deal with it within his fantasy life or not? And if he does deal with it in a fantasy life, then what happens after that? Does it escalate? Does the Idaho 4 killer want to inflict maximum pain? More than this, whoever it is, he wants a bloodbath. And although there is a sexual element, I think there's an overriding sadism. So there's a strong correlation between the sadism of the Long Island serial killer and the Idaho 4 killer, whoever it is. So JonBenet Ramsey is the next one. You may think, wow, a serial killer in Long Island is an awful long way in the psychological sense from the Ramsey case in Boulder, Colorado. This is a stretch. But actually, it's not much of a stretch in terms of the imputed criminal psychology after all. Certainly not if you take it into one particular direction. For example, the same book by the same author is apparently present in both crime scenes. And I've dealt with the MindHunter connection in the JonBenet case in 3 individual videos. If you've never seen them or watched them, I'll put links to them in the description as well. It really is fascinating. Now, the allegation that this book was used as a blueprint to cover up a crime and to outfox law enforcement, even as inspiration for Huerman's HK notes, that Word, MS Word document. So inspiration for his notes, but then also the 3-page ransom note. It's certainly present in some shape or form in the mythos of both cases, and not weakly present, pretty strongly present, pretty prominently present. Although, and it is possible that Huerman even was inspired by news, by reading about the Ramsey case on the other side of America. Because what's really interesting is it seems like the Long Island serial killer started getting to work in the mid to late 90s. And so was he influenced by the Ramsey case in some way? It's hard to think that he wasn't. Now, although there's not necessarily pornography in the Ramsey case, there is an unusual situation where a small child is dressed up as a beauty queen, and though some might argue that there's not necessarily anything strange about this, I don't think there's any doubt that beauty pageants for adults or children involve, to a greater or lesser degree, a kind of objectification of a person. Not as bad as pornography, certainly, but nevertheless a great deal of focus on exteriors or on the superficial. Now, you might say, yeah, there's a little bit of that. It's no big deal, though. But, well, it's the same thing. If you consume huge amounts of pornography and huge amounts of extreme pornography, it's going to be pretty damaging. By the same token, if you're getting involved in pageants and it's about external beauty to a very great extent, then that's also this focus on exteriors, focus on the superficial, focus on pageantry is going to be quite a strong focus as well. I also don't think it's overstating it to say putting makeup on a child, dyeing her hair, dressing her alternately as a grown-up or in skimpy outfits or in outfits that look like they come from those, what's that big extravaganza in Brazil, but that kind of thing with the big feathers. Doing this continuously potentially interferes with how a young child may identify or relate not only to themselves but also to their siblings and their peers, and vice versa as well. We don't really talk about this much when we think about the JonBenet Ramsey case. And there's a lot more to say in this area, which I'm not going to do. I think it suffices to say there was more deprivation and negation in the Ramsey home than I think many of us realize. The very first pages of Perfect Murder, Perfect Town have the gardener saying something about JonBenet crying because she never saw her dad. You don't really hear that brought up very much. And so it also seems to be this area negation that the grand jury indictments are sort of angling towards. So, there's also so much focus in the Ramsey case on adults who might notice a little girl wearing makeup. There's just no real discussion about what I think is perhaps the more obvious aspect. What sort of impact might this have, all of this being in pageants and really sexualizing somebody on the little people around her? What impact is it going to have on the little people around her at home, the little people around her at school? Did it have an impact? Did being a beauty queen have an impact on JonBenet herself? Well, we heard that she went to a doctor something like 30 times, was it, in not many years? Is that average? Is that normal? She didn't seem particularly healthy. She often seemed to be struggling with insomnia, bedwetting, bad breath, colds and whatnot. And so the question is, was she allowed to be who she wanted to be? Was she allowed to be a little girl? Was she allowed to wear? Was she allowed to do? Was she allowed to eat? What was she allowed to do what she wanted? But more particularly, was she not allowed to do a lot of things? Now, we also know that just in Patsy Ramsey's backstory, and I'm just focusing in this area, Patsy's stage 4 cancer would have created a huge amount of self-negation, a huge amount of repression, existential anxiety, and of course, this is to roost somewhere, not only in Patsy herself, but don't forget there are also small children in the picture. Consider the fear that young children may have where their mother is losing her hair, she's critically ill, in hospital she's spending big stretches of time in hospital, and she's battling a terminal illness. She's fighting for her life. What sort of self-negation happens then? Is there any sadism in this story? What do you think? Is there any compensatory aggression here, do you think? Does any sadism emerge during Christmas? If so, how does one person try to ruin another's Christmas, perhaps for their own amusement? If so, who does that? How do they do it? In any event, let's now circle back to the Long Island serial killer and attend to matters of scale and scope. I quickly just want to bring up one other aspect. geographical displacement. There's geographical displacement across all 4 of these cases. The Ramseys dislocate from Atlanta and they come to Boulder, right? Rex Human every day dislocates from the fabric of Massapequa and goes to Manhattan, but more importantly, dislocates from Manhattan and then returns each time to that sort of shack, that ramshackle shack in Massapequa. Then there's the Idaho 4 case where Koberger goes from where he grew up, Pennsylvania, and he goes to somewhere he's never been before. You have the same thing with the Morphews who leave Indiana and they dislocate. There's this displacement once again, geographical displacement. What does that involve? Moving into new buildings, new structures. There's this uprooting. It's not only an uprooting geographically, it's a psychological uprooting. It creates a sense of deep existential anxiety. In a way, it awakens these feelings of aggression in a way, and possibly also compensatory aggression. Okay, so we've moved beyond the 25-minute mark. I want to conclude by, as I say, circling back to the Long Island serial killer case and let's try and discern matters of scale and scope. Do we know the scale of what we're dealing with here? And I get the feeling most people overestimate the Long Island serial killer, and perhaps you could say perhaps I'm underestimating him. One thing Coffindaffer added in this recent interview, I think it was about a day ago with News Nation, it's something that I disagree with, and probably most of you would disagree with me, is this idea that the 6 victims are the tip of the iceberg.
So I think, honestly, Natasha, unfortunately, we are at the tip of the iceberg in terms of victims.
From what
I remember the same thing being said about Koberger. And do you remember what happened with that? So we'll see ultimately who is correct on this. There may be additional victims, but the idea that this is just the tip of the iceberg, that there are perhaps double or triple the amount of victims still out there, that, as far as I'm concerned, is a stretch. The reason I say that is because it suggests there might be some other hunting and dumping ground. Now, you might say, no, it doesn't suggest that. There are a lot more victims in Long Island, in Gilgo Beach, and if that's what you're saying, I'm going to say I doubt it. I think if there were more victims, they would have been found by now. And so if you say, okay, no, there are more victims, but they're not there, I will say, I don't think so, because this is the Massapequa shack is his lair, allegedly. And the area around it is a very, very familiar hunting ground. He grew up there. And he's not going to feel familiar or comfortable anywhere else. And so I just don't see that as likely at all. You might say, well, didn't he go hunting in Manhattan? Well, it's the most densely populated area in the United States, and it's one of the most densely populated areas in the world. As far as I'm concerned, most, if not all, of the human remains to be found in Gilgo Beach have been found. And so I'm open to maybe one more, maybe 2 more, but not really much more than that. I certainly wouldn't refer to it as the tip of the iceberg. I would say most of the iceberg has actually been found. And you might say, I definitely disagree with you on that. But I have to say, I really don't think there's another pile of bodies somewhere. And I could be wrong. I mean, time will tell. It's fairly early. I'm going on a combination of gut feel and the evidence that we've got so far. And if I'm right, it raises one of the most interesting aspects in this case, the most interesting aspect of all, and it's going to be this subject that is the finale, deep dive number 10 in this series. And the title of it is, How Did He Rehabilitate Himself? And obviously, with a title like that, we're assuming that something happened, something went on for a certain period, and then it stopped. And you might very well say, no, it never stopped. And so this is the most hypothetical of all of these deep dives, where we say, if it started, if it went on for a while, and it stopped. Why did it stop? And thus, how did he rehabilitate himself? This looks set to be perhaps one of the most fascinating deep dives of the series. So don't miss this one. Thank you for listening. Don't miss Van Gogh Letters number 81 on the Team Petrie channel. It'll be maybe around about 4 p.m. Eastern, plus or minus, depends on how long it takes to edit this video. But if you're interested in that, if you've never seen it before, pop around. And thank you for listening to the end of this analysis. Take care, and I'll see you guys next time.